Hey there, my name is Joel. For several months now, I've had a new kit. I'm always buying and selling drums, so I always kind of have something new to play with. And this is something I really wanted to share with people because it kind of has a special place in my heart for a few reasons. Several months ago, I was looking at Facebook Marketplace and I saw a listing for a drum kit that was like sitting in a yard. It looked like it was in a yard sale. In fact, when I pulled up, that's exactly what it was. It was a yard sale. He wanted $100 for this kit, but it had a Pacific snare drum in it based on the pictures that he had posted. And I wasn't interested in that. And fortunately, that was gone by the time I got there. Somebody wanted that and bought it. And so he sold me the rest of the kit for $50, which is a 22-inch bass drum, 12 and 13-inch rack toms, a 16-inch floor tom, and actually a pair of hi-hats from Explorer Music, which I think was in Kansas City. Sort of like, I guess, their sort of store brand of hi-hats. They're B8 hi-hats, and I actually like them. So in the audio clips in this video, I actually used those hi-hats because I thought they're kind of cool. The sort of Euro bronze kind of vibe with hi-hats has sort of a special place in my heart. I've mentioned it in other videos. If you watched, you probably know that. But this kit had particular interest to me because of the front head in the picture. It said Maxwin. Maxwin by Pearl. Now, I remember Maxwin drums. I'm an old dude. I'm in my 50s. And when I was a kid, Maxwin was a current company. Maxwin by Pearl. Pearl made Maxwin drums, and Maxwin was a stencil kit. Now, if you don't know what stencil drums are, sort of the classic stencil era, when people talk about stencil drums, they may also say MIJ or made in Japan drums. They're talking about the classic stencil era of sort of like the late 50s through like the very early 80s. There were a handful of Japanese manufacturers that just kind of made drums for import markets, or export for them, but import all over the world that were inexpensive alternatives to the more reputable brands. Like if you were in high school and you wanted, in the 60s and you wanted to be in a band like the Beatles, right? You're all pumped to play drums. Ringo's first 4-piece kit, Ludwig kit that he had, that Black Oyster Pearl at 2012-14 with the matching Jazz Festival snare drum, that adjusted for inflation in today's dollars is around $5,000. And most parents in the 60s weren't going to be putting out that equivalent amount of money so their kid can just kind of bang on some drums for a few months before they get bored and move on to something else. So if and that was the case like for Ludwig and Slingerland and Rogers and Gretsch, right? The big 4 American manufacturers. There weren't too many other alternatives, like Kent drums existed, and those were less expensive. And so there may have been some other things there, but generally the inexpensive or accessible drum market was really kind of populated with these import kits that were made in Japan, primarily by 3 manufacturers. And that's a whole topic for another video, which I do want to get into, but I won't get into it right now. But one of those manufacturers is the company we now know as Pearl. And by the late 70s, they were pretty much the main ones still doing it. And they were making drums for Maxwin, which are the drums in this video. In fact, Maxwin was their own brand. It was Maxwin by Pearl. Sort of like in the 70s, they were like, you know what? We make a lot of stencil drums. Why don't we sort of market our own rather than selling them all to other brand names that are then selling them? We could actually sell a finished product for more money than we're selling wholesale to other people who are then selling retail. So they kind of wanted in on the action. So they created Maxwin. But they were also at the same time making CB700, Apollo, Ruther, Royce. I think there was a company called Jet. And, and they were making a lot of stuff. But by the late 70s, they had moved their manufacturing from Japan to Taiwan. In fact, if you see these drums, they have stickers on them, made in Taiwan, Republic of China. And even though Pearl's a Japanese company, they were actually, by the late 70s, doing their stencil manufacturing in Taiwan. So these could be MIT ROC drums instead of MIJ drums. But why am I even talking about this? I mean, I have a lot of nice drums, and why did I go buy a Maxwin kit, right? Well, for the last, year or so, I've thought a lot about my first drum kit. My first drum kit, which my father bought me and gave me on Christmas Day, 1980. I actually have pictures, a couple of pictures I was able to scrounge up of me playing these drums. Look how happy I look with my 3-piece kit, a 20-inch bass drum, a 12-inch tom, and a matching 5 by 14-inch snare drums with 6 lugs. That bass drum, that 20-inch, also had 6 lugs. And a 12-inch brass cymbal on a non-tilting cymbal holder. And how creative was I to set them up the way I did with the tom on the right and the snare drum on the left rather than, the way it was sort of intended to be set up. I don't know why I did that. I was 12. But it was an Apollo kit. An Apollo kit made by Pearl at their factory in Taiwan. And this was a brand new kit in 1980, so it was probably made sometime, 18 months before my dad bought it. And it had hexagonal mount, a hexagonal rod for the tom mount, which kind of all the drums at that time had. But this Maxwin kit that I got a few months ago actually has a tubular mount, which was the mount that replaced the one that was used for my Apollo kit. But with that exception, the construction of these drums is absolutely identical to the construction of my first drum kit, my Apollo kit. And even though I didn't at that time know that there was a thing called stencil drums, it was obvious to me when I would go to music stores whenever I could, my parents or my older siblings who could drive, anyone who would take me, I'd always go to music stores as much as I could. And I saw Apollo drums. I saw Ruther drums, Royce drums, Jet, CB700. But when I would go and look at all these drums, I noticed they all had the exact same lugs, which happened to be the Pearl coffin lug, which Pearl was using on their professional drums at that time. So I thought, well, I guess that means Pearl makes these drums. They all had the same lugs. They all had the same strainers. They all had the same mufflers. They all had the same finishes for the most part. But like the bass drum pedals, the snare stands, the hi-hat stands, all the hardware was absolutely identical between all these companies when I would go and look at it. So even at that time, I thought, well, Pearl probably is making all of these drums because, as young as I was, I figured to basically be using the exact Pearl lug that Pearl was using and not be Pearl doing that probably would have some sort of legal penalty associated. So I figured Pearl was knocking out these drums. And then, of course, when I learned about Maxwin by Pearl, light bulb went off. Yeah, that's definitely what's happening. So over the last year or so, I've been thinking about my first drum kit. Like I say, there I am on Christmas Day playing it. I'm working on my stink face already. Yeah, right? Getting into it. I make faces all the time when I play. I know my family's given me a hard time about that for years, and not until I actually started doing videos and watching myself did it occur to me, wow, I really do that. But I do. I see what I did. But I thought about that first drum kit, and I thought, I knew nothing about tuning drums. I didn't know about the different kinds of heads, and I knew nothing about shell construction. I knew nothing about microphones and how they were going to alter the sound the moment you stuck a microphone on the drum because, if you get your drums tuned up all nice and then you mic them, you realize they sound totally different on playback than they did while you're playing them because microphones, they do their own thing. And so I didn't know about any of that. I didn't know about, muffling. I didn't know anything. So I had those drums for probably 2 years maybe or so before I got a 63 Ludwig Classic kit, which was a 2012-16 with a Zildjian cymbal and some Zildjian hi-hats and a Superphonic snare drum, which I was very bored with and traded as quickly as I could get rid of that. I so wish I had that drum now, but my junior high had 2 of those drums, and come on, I don't want the drum that my school has. Anyway, I digress. By the time I started to learn my way around tuning and all this stuff, that Apollo set was long gone. And I've wondered in years since what that might sound like today if I were to put nice heads on it and tune it. How would they perform? Another reason I'm interested in that is because those drums were made of lauan, or Philippine mahogany, some people call it. But lauan, there's some other drums that I have to this day that I really like. Tama Imperial Star. I've got a Royal Pewter Tama Imperial Star kit from the early 80s. And I have actually here behind me, that Tama kit right there is a Royal Star Brazilian grain kit, first generation Brazilian grain, which is a very misunderstood drum set and worthy of its own video, which at some point in the future, I'll probably do a little vanity video, just something I like and hope that other people do as well. I like those drums. I like the way they sound. I like the way my Imperial Star kit sounds. I've got some stencil snare drums, a Dixie and an Apollo, an older Apollo. Before they were made by Pearl, they were actually made by the company that became Tama, interestingly enough. All fodder for another video. But I like these old drums, and I kind of wondered, what would I think of my original drum set if I could get it? So this Maxwin kit kind of gave me the opportunity. All that bloviating to say, this gave me a chance to figure that out. It also gave me a chance to restore or refresh a drum kit, and I always love taking an old kit apart, cleaning it up, lubricating everything, and getting rust off of things, and getting everything working nicely, and tuning them up, putting some fresh heads, and just seeing what they sound like. And boy, am I glad I did that. Not only are these drums cool sounding, they are unique sounding, and they continue to sort of demonstrate what I've come to expect from lauan in general, but these are a little bit different because the lauan on the inside is exposed. Those lauan drums, the Royal Star kit, those are sealed on the inside. They have like a hard finish on the inside that's been applied. The Imperial Star drums have a Zolacoat finish on the inside. These Maxwin drums, no finishing at all. It's exposed, wide, open grain wood, so very mellow, very dark. Another characteristic of lauan is that they don't really resonate. It's kind of a brittle wood. If you drill it and machine it, you'll see it just kind of fractures and comes apart. So that can be touchy working with it a little bit. But despite its rigidity, it doesn't really resonate, doesn't really vibrate well. So I wanted to kind of see what it would sound like just to get one of these kits. And I got to say, I'm really pleased with the result because it is a really cool sound. And I'm not going to unpack the sound from my perspective right now. I just want you to hear what they sound like. So I did go ahead and put this whole kit back together again. I cleaned everything and worked all the threads and packed the lugs. There was no foam in the lugs, by the way, so the springs were ringing and making noise. Now they're quiet. I had to rebuild the tom mounts. If you look at the pictures, you can see from the listing pictures that each tom had a part of the mount stuck in the tom still, and then the other part of the mount was still stuck in the bass drum. Together, I basically had most of the whole mount. I had to sort of kind of put it all back together, which I did with some JB Weld epoxy, the heavy stuff, the gray stuff is like 5,000 pounds per square inch kind of strength, and then some rivets as well. So that stuff's not coming apart. It's going to outlast me. And I put resonance mounts on the toms because these are, this kit was made probably a couple of years after my first kit, my Apollo kit that I had as a kid. This kit has tubular mounts, and the tubular mounts are a thinner tube than what Pearl typically uses, the 7/8, inch tubing that they use normally. This was 5/8 inch, but it's tubular, it's not solid. So because of that, I wanted to sort of isolate the drums from the hardware so the energy doesn't just sort of go into the bass drum and go away. So I put some resonance mounts on them. The drum heads that I used, I had an Aquarian Force 1 clear on the batter side of the bass drum. The front side, I went ahead and kept the original head because I had the Maxwin logo on it, but it's a really cheap head. It was Remo's entry-level head 45 years ago. It's called a Soundmaster, which I think is like their lightweight, like Diplomat film, but with an epoxy or plastic hoop instead of an aluminum hoop. And it was coated. And like I say, it's like 4 decades old, so it's nice and stretched out, but I went ahead and used it because it had the logo, although I realized later I didn't actually show the logo when I was playing, so I could have put a better head, like an Aquarian Force 2 or something on the front, but I didn't. So anyway, it has the original head on the front. The batter heads on the toms are Aquarian Response 2, which is a dual 7mm film, double ply head that are coated. I use the coated versions. And then the bottoms are Classic Clear, which is a 10mm single ply clear head on the toms. Now, the bottom of the toms had no heads on them when I got them, but unlike pretty much every kit that I've ever seen like that, the edges were not damaged at all. The edges were pristine. Now, I did notice when I was putting the drums back together, there was a little bit of ply separation in one spot on each of the rack toms. So I addressed that with a little bit of watered down glue that I kind of let drip in there, and then I clamped them down. And that took care of that without any problem. And just put them all back together and tuned them up. The snare drum I'm using, just so you know, is a 70s era Ludwig Acrolite that a previous owner put this kind of crunchy black powder coat on it. It's not Black Galaxy. It's not a 90s Acrolite. It is a 70s, but it's got this kind of crunchy powder coat, and it's on the inside too, and it gives the drum kind of a dry vibe, and I like it, and I thought it would be an interesting match for this. Okay, so here's the audio. If you've listened to me this far, congratulations getting through all of my noise. Listen to these drums. Like I say, I'm not going to unpack what I notice about this. There's no muffling on these drums. A little bit in the bass drum, just a skosh, not on the front head. Well, the front head has a piece of felt, actually. because it really didn't sound good when it was resonating free. I generally leave the front head on a bass drum. If you've watched my bass drum tuning videos, you know I generally don't do much and let those kind of resonate a little bit. Didn't really resonate, so just to kind of keep it from causing problems, I put a strip of felt in there just to kind of contain it. And there's a pillow on the bottom, barely touching the battery head maybe, but really not much in the way of muffling. No muffling at all on the toms. I think there's a piece of tape on the top of the snare. That's pretty typical. The snare head, I believe, is just a texture-coated head, medium weight, single ply, texture-coated head. And that's it. There's no muffling at all. No muffling, okay? And there's isolation mounts on the tom. So listen to the tonality. I'll come back to this in a future video, but listen to the tonality overall of the drums. They are double ply heads, but there's no muffling. They're tuned kind of to the mid-range a little bit, 12, 13, 16. Listen to the tonality, listen to the length, the sustain, or lack, or whatever the case may be. Listen for that. Listen for the attack to tone ratio, the tone that they have, but then how the attack sort of marries with that tone, the overall presentation of the drums. I will say very little processing on these drums, a little bit of, you know, you got to do a little EQ, a little compression just to kind of make things sound sort of the way people expect them to, but I'm not really going for a sound. I wasn't doing a processed thing to create a processed sound. I'm more or less trying to sort of generically, in a good quality, present these drums. And if you've watched many of my other videos, you'll have something to compare these to. But just kind of take notice. What do you think about the sound of these? First of all, do you like the sound? First of all, do you like the sound? Secondly, how does it differ, or does it differ from other drum sounds? What kind of music do you think this kind of sound would be optimized for? And again, remember, there's no muffling on these drums. Okay, one observation I am willing to share is that I noticed that as I listen to these, I can get a sound sort of like this out of other drums that I have. Nicer drums, maple drums, you know, expensive drums. But I have to use a lot of muffling to do it. And I kind of got to mess with them a little bit to make them do this. These drums just kind of do it automatically. And that is incredibly valuable to me. I don't care about the name. I don't care about the prestige or lack thereof. I care about the instrument and what it's capable of doing. When I want a sound like this, these are now kind of my go-to drums when I'm recording because they do this effortlessly. I don't have to mess with them as much as I have to other drums to kind of get this sort of sound. Okay, so that's a spoiler, I guess. Now you can listen. Thanks for watching this, by the way. I appreciate you spending your time with me. I know you can be doing other things, so I appreciate it. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe, share this with other people, like, comment, do all that good stuff. I love to hear feedback from people. And thanks for being here. Thanks so much. Take care.